Hello everyone. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about Victorian poetry. Students, in the history of English literature, whenever there is any reference to Victorian poetry, the names of the great poets which come into our mind are Alfred Tennyson, Robert Browning, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and Matthew Arnold. And all these four poets are prescribed there in your syllabus, and you have read Tennyson's poem The Lotus Eaters, Rabbi Ben Ezra by Robert Browning, and Sohrab and Rustam by Matthew Arnold. So now, before discussing in detail about the salient features of Victorian poetry, let's try to understand the Victorian society, the Victorian age, that how the society was, how the contemporary people lived, behaved, and what were their attitude towards life. So let's first have a quick overview of the Victorian age. Students, as the name suggests, this age is named after Queen Victoria, and this age covers the age of Queen Victoria's reign in England, that was from 1837 to 1901. This period was a period of great political, social and religious change in the history of England. And this very change and this very restless spirit of Victorian progressive society is reflected in the Victorian poetry. So how this restless spirit was prevalent during the times? Let's have a look. As I have said, that Victorian age was the age of change. So if we just try to understand these changes, we will find that these changes were multifold. There were changes in the political arena, in the religion, in social and economic setup, in science and education also. When we talk about the changes in the political system, we feel that find that this age was the age of political awakening. So many political reforms took place during this period, and in brief we can say that this age was the age of the progress of democracy. And as far as social and economic setup, changes in the social and economic setup are concerned, this was the age of industrial and mechanical progress. And just because of industrial progress, there was material prosperity, and when with prosperity, and there was obviously class conflicts were there. So this was an age of social unrest also. And secondly, in terms of changes in the religious setup, this was the age when Darwin's canonical text, The Origin of Species, was published, and that text just changed the whole outlook of people towards religion. Thirdly, this was an age of expansion of education, and fourthly, there was the development of science, as I have just mentioned you, that Darwin's theory of evolution, which was published in his book The Origin of Species. So in this way, in all the fields of life, the great changes were occurring in the Victorian age, and the same is reflected in the literature. And if we just try to summarize that how the changes in the contemporary society have just placed or reflected in the Victorian literature, or in other words we can say that if we try to locate the famous Victorian poets and their writings in a particular context or in the context of the Victorian society, we feel that there are two factors which deeply affected the literature of this age. They are the germination of the seeds of democracy. With democracy, the spirit of liberty, the spirit of equality took place, and this spirit of equality and liberty changed the whole social pattern. And secondly, the emergence of scientific outlook with the publication of Darwin's book of the origin of species. Darwin's book just gave the theory of evolution, and this theory of evolution has just shook the faith of the people in traditional view of religion. And the publication of this canonical text by Darwin infected the poetry with the spirit of scientific observation and philosophical analysis. And this scientific outlook changed the mental makeup of the people of this age, and it became trendy to show a spirit of inquisitiveness, to express doubts, to question. So in other words, we can say that there was a rise in conflict between religion and science, between blind faith and the spirit of questioning, and the same is reflected in the literature of the age. And now we'll talk about the chief features of Victorian poetry. So Victorian poetry, as you have seen in the previous slide, that Victorian poetry is just reflection of the changes which took place in Victorian society. So this is rightly called the poetry of great change and complexity. And the salient features of this poetry are, the first thing, that it deals with a search for knowledge or for something symbolizing knowledge and certainty. Secondly, it was not written to give some theory or teach something, but to question why, how, and what. It has the spirit of questioning. Thirdly, Victorian poetry reflects Victorian compromise. That is, that it attempts to bring compromise between science and religion, between the old and the new patterns of life. It also deals with the portal of nature. It is realistic. It is rich in medieval legends, myths and fables. The poets has just took the themes for their poems, for their writings from the medieval legends, myths and fables, as you have seen in the Lotus Eaters by Tennyson or the Sohrab and Rustam by Matthew Arnold. And Victorian poets experimented with the literary forms and poetic diction. Here the point is that not only in terms of theme, in terms of style, in terms of form, in terms of diction also, the Victorian poets experimented a lot. And one of the famous examples is Robert Browning's dramatic monologues. Students, Victorian poetry is divided into two groups. One is called the High Victorian poetry. This group includes poets like Tennyson, Browning, and Matthew Arnold. Then the second one is the Pre-Raphaelite poetry. Students, Raphael was a famous painter, and this group includes D.Z. Rogers, William Morris, and Swinburne. The chief features of Pre-Raphaelite poetry are an extension of Romantic revival, because Victorian poetry just began with the closing of the Romantic age. So in the Pre-Raphaelite poetry, there is an extension of Romantic revival. There is love for past. This poetry is basically art written for art's sake. It is also known for its pictorial quality. There is love of symbolism. The music and melody gives it a special flavor. And lastly, I would like to talk about the famous Victorian poets. The very first name which appears in the scene is Lord Alfred Tennyson. He is called the representative poet of Victorian era. Then there is Robert Browning, who is known for his innovation dramatic monologue. Then there is his wife Elizabeth Barrett Browning. George Meredith is also there, and Matthew Arnold is also a well-known elegiac poet of the age. So, and we can also talk about Hopkins also. Although in terms of theme and style, his poetry makes a departure from the Victorian tradition, but still chronologically he also belongs to the Victorian period. So student, this is all about Victorian poetry, which is rightly called the poetry of change because it was written during those very times when the Society of England was going through great change in terms of politics with the Reform Acts, with the rise of democracy, and in the economic field with the Industrial Revolution, and in the religious field with the publication of Darwin's The Origin of Species. A great change has occurred, and this change is reflected there in the attitude of these poets towards the reflection of society in their writings. Thank you.